In this talk, I want to look at how historians think about a very important piece of legislation that became law in 1689, an act for exempting their Majesties' Protestant subjects dissenting from the Church of England from the penalties of certain laws, more commonly known as the Toleration Act. The Toleration Act granted to dissenting, that is non-Anglican Protestants in England and Wales, a right to worship freely outside of the state church. This is an interesting piece of legislation to examine, not only because it remained in place for the whole of what is sometimes called the long 18th century, but also because for historians it raises important questions about how we frame our interpretations of the past. Because the Toleration Act granted freedom of worship to Protestant dissenters, it has sometimes been characterised as an early example of modern liberalism. But the detail of the Toleration Act speaks not to a live and let live philosophy of peaceful and inclusive coexistence between faith communities, but to something quite different. Let's look at that detail. The Toleration Act excluded as well as included. Clause 14 of the Act expressly excluded Roman Catholics and anybody questioning the Trinity. To these people, freedom of worship did not extend. Secondly, it remained the law of the land that anybody not granted freedom of worship under the Toleration Act was expected to attend Sunday service at an Anglican church. Thirdly, Clause 16 of the Toleration Act made clear that any dissenting group wishing to set up a chapel or meeting house for non-Anglican worship would first need a certificate of permission from the local bishop, archdeacon, or justice of the peace. Another example, Clause 4 of the Toleration Act stipulated that any dissenting group worshipping outside of the Church of England must not bolt, bar, or lock the doors of its chapel or meeting house on pain of losing the privileges extended to that chapel or meeting house by the Toleration Act. The point here was that the Church of England reserved the right to inspect dissenting chapels and meeting houses for evidence of sedition, if suspected. We could go on, but I think you see the point that I'm trying to make. Exclusions, expectations, permissions, suspicions, and stipulations, the tone of the Toleration Act was anything but live and let live. What it offered, to those to whom it offered it, was certainly better than religious persecution, but freedom of worship was framed by the Anglican state more as a gift from the state than as a natural right claimed against the state by dissenters themselves. And because it was framed in that way, it came with heavy qualifications. Paying close and careful attention in this way to how the Toleration Act was written offers a salutary lesson to us as historians in three ways. First, it reminds us that we do frame things that we study in the past. We apply isms like liberalism, and we apply characterizations like live and let live. We gloss the past, and we call this interpretation. Secondly, what this reminds us is that we frame things sometimes in ways that reflect our own ways of thinking as much as how people in the past were thinking. We call this anachronism, and as historians, we have to be careful not to fall into it. Thirdly, and finally, getting as close as possible to the detail of our sources and being ready to use detail to challenge some of the broader ways in which we frame things represents the best way to avoid anachronism.